A young girl opens her gate to a stray pitbull, but no one could imagine he'd become the hero who would save her life. Mia gripped the edge of her ragged dress with one small, dusty hand, the other clutching a half-eaten piece of bread. She was barely aware of the sound of her own soft breathing as she sat alone in the yard, her bony knees pressed to her chest. She liked to watch the world from here, even if it was just the birds, the neighbors who passed by, or the occasional squirrel scrambling up the tree. It was her own little corner, a quiet place where she didn't have to feel small or shy. Mia was only 3, but she already knew about loneliness. Her days passed in a quiet rhythm. Her mother, Alice, went to work early each day, leaving Mia to play in the dusty yard with nothing but her mother's old Bup Bay, a doll that had long ago lost its color, one eye missing, and the hem of its dress frayed. The doll was Mia's only companion since her father had passed away last year, and Mia clung to it, as if holding on to her mother's stories about her father through its worn fabric. The village they lived in was small and tired, tucked away among fields and worn-down houses. After her father died, Alice had struggled, working long hours for meager pay, doing everything she could to keep food on their table and a roof over their heads. Yet, despite her mother's efforts, Mia felt a quiet ache, an emptiness that grew larger each time her mother left. She was too young to play with the older kids in the village, too shy to even approach them. Most days, she spent the afternoon alone, playing by herself in the dusty yard, tracing circles in the dirt with sticks or talking quietly to her doll. Sometimes she would sit by the gate, peering out into the narrow road, hoping for something interesting, anything to break the stillness. And then, one day, it happened. Today, a new pair of eyes was watching her. Just outside the gate stood a dog, a large, muscular pit bull with a rugged look that could make anyone wary. Its fur was matted and patchy, with dirt caked around its paws and face. One of its ears looked as though it had been torn in a fight. Yet, despite its fierce look, the dog was standing perfectly still, staring at her with an expression that was almost gentle. Its eyes, a warm shade of brown, held a softness that didn't match its rough exterior. The dog's gaze was locked on her, or rather, on the bread she held with an almost pleading look, as if asking for permission to come closer. For a few moments, neither moved. The dog's gaze never wavered. It seemed to be waiting, hopeful yet worn down. Mia could feel her own heartbeat quicken, and her instinct was to shrink back, maybe even bolt. But then she looked closer at its face, at the gentle droop of its eyes, the way it stood there, so patiently. Not even a bark, not even a whine. "Hey," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking louder would shatter the moment. She hesitated, then slowly stretched her hand forward, offering the rest of her bread to the dog, carefully placing it just on her side of the gate. The dog's ears perked up, but it didn't move right away, only shifted its eyes from her face to the bread and back again. Finally, as if reassured by her quiet presence, it padded forward, slowly, deliberately, sniffing the bread before taking it with a careful gentleness. Mia held her breath, her small heart pounding. The dog didn't gobble it up like she'd imagined, but took slow bites, as if savoring it, as if that small act of kindness meant everything in the world. And once it was done, it sat back down, watching her again with those calm, brown eyes. "You don't have anywhere to go, do you?" she murmured, almost to herself. Mia slowly reached out, her hand hovering just shy of its snout, her fingers trembling slightly. The dog didn't flinch, didn't retreat. It only leaned forward, pressing its wet nose to her fingertips. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and felt a tentative smile tug at the corners of her mouth. "You're not scary," she whispered, almost as if reassuring herself. The dog didn't budge from its spot, and somehow that made her feel safer than she had in a long time. The next few minutes drifted by in quiet understanding between them. Finally, as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the yard, Mia stood up and took a small step back, her fingers clutching the gate. Maybe you can come inside for a bit," she whispered, almost as if the idea itself was fragile, something that would scatter if she said it too loud. With a small tug, she opened the gate, her eyes never leaving the dog. She watched as the rough-looking pitbull padded quietly into the yard, his heavy paws leaving faint prints in the dirt. He sat down beside her, as if he'd been there all along, like he belonged. The two sat in peaceful silence, Mia occasionally glancing over, her tiny fingers brushing over his scarred fur, tracing the lines of old battles and lost fights. The dog leaned into her touch, his eyes softening, their unspoken bond growing with each passing minute. That's when the sound of her mother's car pulling into the driveway shattered their quiet moment. Mia's eyes widened, a hint of panic flashing across her small face. She knew how Alice felt about animals, especially stray dogs. She quickly patted the dog's head, hoping he'd stay quiet, but it was too late. Alice rounded the corner, her gaze immediately landing on the dog. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as her eyes took in the sight of the large black pit bull sitting beside her daughter. The dog's appearance, muscular, scarred, with a dark, intimidating coat, set off alarms in her head. Panic surged through her veins, and her face twisted with shock and anger. "Mia, are you out of your mind?" Alice's voice was sharp, a mix of fear and fury. "What on earth possessed you to let a filthy stray like that into our yard?" "But, Mama, he's not dangerous," Alice interrupted, her voice thick with sarcasm as she looked the dog over. "Look at him, Mia. He's big, dirty, probably carrying who knows what kind of disease, and he's got scars all over his face. This is not some harmless puppy." Mia's shoulders shrank, and she looked down, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her dress. The dog, sensing the tension, simply sat quietly, his eyes never leaving her, a calm presence amid Alice's harsh words. Mia's cheeks flushed, and she opened her mouth to argue, but Alice shook her head firmly. "We're getting him out of here, right now." She glanced around, spotting a half-eaten loaf of bread on the kitchen counter through the window. "Wait here, Mia," she said, her tone firm but cold. She moved quickly, grabbing the bread and tearing off a large piece. Holding it out, she waved it in front of the dog, trying to lure him toward the gate. The dog's eyes flickered between her and Mia, hesitation evident, but he slowly rose to his feet, his gaze dropping to the bread. Alice led him toward the gate, the bread in her outstretched hand. The moment he stepped outside, she quickly pulled the gate shut and locked it, her hands trembling. Mia watched, her eyes welling up with tears. She tried to hold back a sob as the dog looked back at her, his brown eyes soft and full of trust, before slowly settling down just outside the gate. That evening, as they sat down to a sparse dinner, Mia kept glancing toward the door, hoping for a glimpse of her new friend outside. Her heart was heavy, and the few bites of food on her plate seemed to grow colder and less appetizing with each glance. She could still see his big, calm eyes watching her in her mind, the quiet way he had waited by her side, and her heart ached. Alice, noticing Mia's distracted gaze, set her fork down with a clink and sighed. "What's on your mind, Mia?" she asked, though her voice was still tinged with frustration. Mia hesitated, her small voice barely a whisper. "Mama, can we keep him?" Alice's expression hardened immediately, her eyes narrowing. "Absolutely not," she said, her tone flat and final. "Mia, we can barely afford to keep ourselves fed, let alone some stray dog. Do you understand how hard it is to put food on this table every night?" "But Mama," Mia pleaded, her eyes welling up with fresh tears. "He's all alone out there, just like us. I don't think he has anywhere else to go." Alice shook her head, her patience thinning. "I don't care where he came from. He's not our responsibility, Mia. Dogs like that, they're trouble. They need food, care, and who knows how much else. We can't even afford medicine for ourselves if we get sick. Do you really think we can manage a dog?" Mia's shoulders slumped as she looked down at her plate, her appetite completely gone. She understood the words her mother was saying, but in her heart, all she could think about was how safe she'd felt with the dog beside her, how he hadn't hurt her, hadn't even barked, just watched her with those kind eyes. Alice's voice softened a little as she saw Mia's dejected face, but her tone remained firm. "Look, sweetheart, I know you're lonely, and I know you like that dog, but we have to be realistic. We don't have the luxury to take in every stray that wanders by." Mia nodded silently, though her heart wasn't in it. Her mother's words felt heavy, like stones, pressing down on her chest, but she didn't know how to argue back. She swallowed hard, blinking back tears, and forced herself to take another bite of food. That night, as Mia lay in bed, she listened to the quiet sounds outside, hoping, praying that the dog hadn't gone far. She wanted so badly to open the door, to sneak out and let him back in. But the memory of her mother's angry face held her back. Instead, she whispered into the darkness, hoping that somehow the dog could hear her. The next morning, when Mia slipped out to the yard, she gasped. There, lying just outside the gate, was the dog, his head resting on his paws, his eyes lighting up as soon as he saw her. She pressed her hands against the gate, a wide smile breaking across her face. "You're back," she whispered, trying to keep her voice low so her mother wouldn't hear. The dog lifted his head, his tail giving a soft wag. He didn't make a sound, as if he understood the need to stay quiet. For the next few days, he continued to wait there, showing up each morning and lying patiently by the gate, his gaze following Mia as she played in the yard. Every so often, he would let out a quiet whine, his eyes never leaving her. Alice noticed, of course. Each time she passed the window and saw that big, dark shape outside, her chest tightened. She was torn between her daughter's quiet hope and her own fear. But every evening when she locked the door, she told herself it was for the best, that her daughter's safety was her priority. 3 days passed this way, and with each morning that the dog returned, something in Alice softened. She watched as Mia leaned against the gate, her little fingers slipping through to scratch his fur. Her laughter soft but more genuine than Alice had heard in a long time. And the dog, he stayed gentle, patient, his eyes kind, almost as if he knew he was waiting for permission to come closer. By the 4th day, Alice's resolve broke. That morning, as she stood by the door, watching her daughter's face light up with joy, she felt a pang of guilt. She couldn't remember the last time Mia had smiled like that. Her daughter, who had become so shy and withdrawn, was finally showing a spark of happiness. She sighed, opening the door and stepping outside. She felt the dog's eyes on her, but this time there was no fear, just a quiet acceptance. She crouched down, meeting Mia's wide, hopeful gaze. "All right, Mia," she said, her voice softening. "I'll let him stay, but only if he proves he can behave." She looked at the dog, who seemed to stand a little taller, almost as if he understood her words. Mia threw her arms around her mother, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Thank you, Mama. Thank you." Alice managed a small smile, watching as Mia pushed the gate open and let the dog step inside. He didn't rush in. Instead, he padded over to Mia, his tail wagging gently, his eyes full of gratitude. Over the next few days, Mia and her new friend became inseparable. Wherever she went in the yard, he was there, his steady presence bringing her a sense of security she hadn't felt before. He would sit beside her quietly while she played with her old doll, or listen attentively as she whispered secrets and small hopes to him. It was as if he understood her, offering silent companionship and comfort. One afternoon, while they sat together under the shade of the old tree, Mia looked at him thoughtfully. She tilted her head, taking in his strong frame, his quiet but protective stance, and the gentle kindness in his eyes. "You need a name," she murmured, her fingers brushing softly through his fur. Something strong like you." The dog lifted his head, his ears perking up slightly as if he was waiting, listening closely to the words she had to say. "How about—" She paused, a smile forming on her lips. "Ranger." She tested the name, watching to see if he would react. "Ranger," she repeated, her voice a little stronger this time. The dog's tail gave a faint wag, and he leaned in closer, nudging her hand with his nose. It was as if he was accepting it, understanding that this name would be his, a name given to him by the little girl he'd chosen to protect. Mia's smile grew wider, and she wrapped her arms around him, hugging him tightly. "Ranger," she whispered again, her voice filled with affection. "You'll be my ranger, my friend, my protector." From that moment on, he wasn't just the dog anymore. He was Ranger, and the bond between them grew deeper, stronger with every passing day. But life for Mia and her mother Alice was about to change in ways she couldn't predict. A few months later, Alice announced she had met someone. His name was Marcus, and he came across as a quiet, composed man, the type who seemed to have answers Alice had been looking for since her husband's death. For Alice, who had struggled with raising Mia alone, Marcus offered the idea of stability. He was respectful and well-spoken, seemingly ready to help share the load she had carried for years. At first, Marcus was pleasant, even affectionate toward Mia, giving her gentle smiles and a nod of approval when she greeted him. Alice watched them interact with a hopeful heart, convinced that this new beginning would bring her small family the happiness it had been missing. However, Marcus's presence brought an unspoken tension to the house that Mia couldn't ignore. She noticed the way his expressions changed when her mother wasn't around. Those smiles, once reassuring, started to feel shallow, empty, his eyes distant and cold. Ranger, too, seemed to pick up on this change. Whenever Marcus entered the room, Ranger would grow quiet, his body tense, his watchful eyes tracking Marcus's every move. One evening, as Alice cooked dinner in the kitchen, Marcus approached Mia in the living room where she sat on the floor with Ranger. She felt his shadow fall over her before she looked up. There was something sharp in his gaze, a look that didn't match his pleasant words. "You know, Mia," he began, his voice low, almost a whisper. "It's time for you to act like a big girl. You don't need that dog following you around all the time. It's ridiculous." Mia froze, instinctively pulling Ranger closer to her. She didn't know how to respond, her throat tight with fear. She tried to tell herself that Marcus was just trying to help, like her mother always said, but something inside her felt uneasy. Ranger, sensing her distress, leaned into her, his dark eyes never leaving Marcus's face. When Mia finally mustered the courage to tell Alice about Marcus's tone and the way he made her feel, Alice dismissed it, brushing it off as Mia being too sensitive. She thought Mia just needed more time to adjust to having a father figure in the house. But things didn't get better. When Alice was away at work or running errands, Marcus's mask began to slip. His words turned sharper, his patience wore thinner. Small incidents started happening, times when he would push Mia aside or grab her arm a bit too hard, his eyes flashing with anger over the smallest things. "Stop looking at me like that, Mia," he'd hiss, whenever he caught her staring. Ranger stayed vigilant. The dog's calm demeanor turned tense whenever Marcus was nearby. His gaze narrowed, his body a protective barrier between Mia and Marcus. Ranger seemed to understand the unspoken threat, and he refused to leave Mia alone in Marcus's presence. He would sit beside her, a silent yet imposing figure, warning Marcus without a sound. The unease built into something undeniable one afternoon when Alice was out grocery shopping. Marcus's mood had been dark all day, his footsteps heavy and his brow furrowed with barely concealed frustration. When Mia accidentally spilled her glass of water at lunch, his anger snapped. "What is wrong with you, huh?" he snarled, his voice a harsh growl. Before she could react, he lunged, grabbing her shoulder roughly. His fingers dug into her small frame, and Mia let out a frightened gasp. Ranger was there in an instant, his stance protective as he moved between Marcus and Mia. He let out a low, threatening growl, a sound Mia had never heard before. Marcus glared down at the dog, his face twisted with anger. "Get out of here, you useless mutt!" he spat, shoving Ranger with his foot. But Ranger stood his ground, his gaze unwavering, teeth slightly bared as he continued to growl, warning Marcus to back off. Mia clung to Ranger, her fear fading just a little as she felt his strength beside her. Ranger wasn't afraid. He wouldn't let Marcus hurt her. Later that night at the dinner table, Alice noticed how quiet Mia was, her shoulders tense, her gaze fixed on her plate. She tried to prompt her daughter to talk, but Mia remained silent, her usual spark dulled, her eyes clouded with worry. "Sweetheart, are you feeling all right?" Alice asked, her voice soft. Mia hesitated, glancing briefly at Marcus, who shot her a cold look across the table. She swallowed hard and shook her head, barely able to find her voice. "I'm okay, Mama." But Alice noticed something else. Ranger, who usually sat peacefully by Mia's side, was eyeing Marcus with a steady, unblinking stare. His body was tense, his gaze filled with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. It was unlike anything Alice had seen before, and a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. She wondered if there was something she hadn't been seeing, something hidden beneath Marcus's composed exterior. Alice's uncertainty grew in the following days. Each time she caught Mia flinching or saw Ranger growling softly when Marcus walked past, the feeling gnawed at her. But deep down, a mother's instinct told her otherwise. As weeks passed, the tension between Marcus, Mia, and Ranger only deepened. Mia became quieter, more withdrawn, and Ranger grew ever more protective, refusing to let Marcus approach without positioning himself defensively between them. One evening, when Alice had to run an errand in town, leaving Mia and Marcus alone, the house felt colder, a quiet unease settling over the empty rooms. Ranger sat close to Mia, his body like a shield, his eyes never leaving Marcus, who paced the living room, restless and irritable. A few hours later, Alice returned, greeted by an unusual silence. She found Mia sitting stiffly on the couch, her eyes red-rimmed, and Ranger positioned beside her as though he hadn't moved an inch since she left. The unease she'd been ignoring suddenly became impossible to dismiss. Something wasn't right. One evening, after Alice noticed a faint bruise peeking out from under Mia's sleeve, her worry grew sharper, an instinctive fear gnawing at her mind. She gently pulled Mia aside, brushing her daughter's hair back to get a closer look at the bruise. "Mia, what happened?" she asked, keeping her voice soft. Her fingers traced the faint outline of the bruise, her heart sinking with each silent second. Mia hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid Marcus would appear any moment. "Nothing, Mama," she whispered, barely meeting her mother's eyes. But Alice couldn't ignore the trembling in Mia's voice or the way she instinctively covered her arms as though she were trying to protect herself from being seen. Alice's thoughts raced. She knew something was wrong, something far beyond what Mia was willing to admit. She needed proof, something undeniable that would confirm her worst suspicions. And then an idea struck her, a way to capture the truth without relying solely on Mia's fearful, hesitant words. The following morning, while Marcus was out, Alice went to a nearby store and purchased a small security camera. Her hands shook as she set it up, positioning it in the corner of the living room, carefully hidden within the decor. She felt a pang of guilt, but it was overshadowed by the fierce determination in her heart. She needed to know. That evening, Alice kept her distance, observing every interaction between Marcus and Mia with an alertness she'd never felt before. The next day, after Marcus left for work, Alice sat down and scrolled through the recorded footage, her breath catching in her throat as she scanned each frame. And then she saw it. The scene playing out before her felt like a nightmare, a truth she desperately hoped wouldn't exist. Marcus entered the living room, and as Mia sat quietly on the floor with Ranger, Marcus's expression shifted, a coldness hardening his features. She watched, horrified, as he grabbed Mia's arm, his fingers digging into her skin, his face twisted in anger. Mia's face filled with terror, her small frame shrinking under his grip. Ranger's growl rumbled through the speakers, and Alice saw him inching closer to Mia, his body tense, ready to intervene. Marcus shoved Mia back with such force that she stumbled, catching herself just before she fell. Alice's hands covered her mouth, her body shaking as she rewound the footage, watching it once, twice, needing to confirm the horrifying reality. Her daughter, her precious Mia, had been suffering under her own roof, under the hands of the man she had trusted. The fury building within her was like a wildfire, spreading through every part of her. Without a second thought, she grabbed her phone and texted Marcus, demanding he come home immediately. She didn't care about hiding her anger or her intention. He needed to face the consequences of what he had done. When Marcus arrived, the tension was immediate. Alice stood in the center of the living room, her arms crossed, the footage queued up on the TV behind her. Mia was in her room, Ranger by her side, the door firmly shut. She wasn't going to allow him near her daughter again. "What's this all about, Alice?" Marcus asked, his tone casual, an edge of irritation in his voice. Alice's eyes were sharp, her face pale but resolute. She gestured toward the screen, pressing play on the footage without a word. The scene unfolded again, Marcus's cruel grip on Mia's arm, the fear in her daughter's eyes. As the footage ended, Alice felt her stomach twist, her anger at the boiling point. How could you?" she said, her voice shaking. "How could you put your hands on my daughter? What kind of person are you?" Marcus's expression darkened, his gaze flicking between her and the screen, irritation morphing into defensiveness. "Oh, come on, Alice," he scoffed. "You're going to believe a bit of footage? Mia's just a brat who doesn't respect anyone. She deserved a lesson." Alice's fury surged, her voice rising. "A lesson? She's a child, Marcus. She's my child. You have no right to lay a hand on her. You're too soft on her, Alice. Someone has to set boundaries. His voice was cold, dismissive, but beneath his tone was a hint of something darker, a warning. Alice shook her head, her voice laced with disgust. Get out. I don't care where you go, but you're never coming near me or Mia again. Marcus's face twisted, his calm demeanor shattering. In a flash, he stepped forward and slapped her hard across the face, the force sending her stumbling backward. Pain exploded in her cheek, and she raised her hand to her face, her shock mixing with fury. You think you can just throw me out? He hissed, his voice low and menacing. After everything I've done for you? Alice tried to pull free, but his grip tightened, and she winced, pain shooting up her arm. Let go of me, Marcus, she shouted, her voice trembling. I'm calling the police. This ends now. Before she could reach her phone, Marcus struck her again, harder this time, and she fell back against the wall, dazed. At that moment, Mia peeked out from her room, her small face pale with fear as she saw her mother lying on the floor, pain etched across her face. Mama! Mia cried, rushing out of her room to her mother's side. She tried to shield Alice, her little arms spread protectively, her eyes wide with terror and defiance. Marcus's face contorted with rage. You too, huh? He sneered. You think you can just get away with disrespecting me? He raised his hand and struck Mia, the blow knocking her to the floor beside Alice. Mia whimpered, clutching her cheek, tears filling her eyes as she glanced at her mother, too frightened to move but determined to stay close. Alice's protective instincts surged. Despite the pain, she wrapped her arms around Mia, her voice fierce and unyielding. You monster! Don't you dare touch her again! But Marcus's rage only intensified. He released Alice abruptly and stalked into the kitchen, yanking open a drawer and pulling out a knife. He turned back to them, his eyes wild, the blade glinting in his hand. You think you can just throw me away? He snarled, his voice a dangerous whisper. I don't think so, Alice. If I'm going down, we're all going down together. Alice's heart raced, her mind spinning as she backed away, terror gripping her. She glanced toward Mia, her only thought of protecting her daughter. But as Marcus raised the knife, a low growl echoed from behind her. Ranger, sensing the danger, positioned himself between Marcus and Alice and Mia, his stance protective, his teeth bared in a fierce snarl. The dog's eyes blazed with a fierce determination, an unspoken promise to protect them no matter the cost. Marcus hesitated, the knife wavering in his hand as he eyed Ranger, a flash of fear crossing his face. But his anger was relentless, and, with a furious yell, he lunged toward them, the knife poised. But Ranger lunged forward without hesitation, colliding with Marcus and knocking him off balance. The two of them tumbled to the floor, a blur of fur and fists, growls and yells. Alice clutched Mia tightly, whispering reassurances to her, though her own heart raced with fear. Ranger scrambled to his feet and stood firm, a shield between Marcus and the two he was sworn to protect. Marcus, face twisted with fury, raised the knife again and, with a wild swing, drove it into Ranger's side. The dog let out a sharp yelp of pain, his body jolting, but he remained rooted, his legs planted firmly in front of Alice and Mia. Blood began to seep from the wound, staining his fur, but his eyes never wavered from Marcus. Despite the pain radiating through his body, Ranger's stance grew even more determined, his gaze locked on Marcus, his teeth bared in a silent snarl. Marcus took a step back, the reality of Ranger's strength finally dawning on him. He hesitated, glancing at the knife in his hand, then back at the bleeding dog before him. In a surge of desperation, Marcus tried one last time to shove Ranger aside, lunging forward, hoping to bypass the loyal protector. But Ranger would not yield. With a final, fierce growl, he pushed against Marcus, forcing him back just enough to give Alice and Mia an opening. "Now, Mia, run!" Alice whispered urgently, pulling Mia up as she rose to her feet. The door was only a few feet away, their chance to escape widening as Ranger continued to fend off Marcus with every ounce of strength he had left. Grabbing Mia's hand, Alice dashed toward the door, pulling it open with a trembling hand. They slipped outside, the cool air hitting their faces like a promise of safety. The two of them stumbled down the porch steps, Mia clutching her mother's hand, her eyes wet with tears, glancing back toward the open door, her heart breaking for the dog who'd saved them. Just as they reached the edge of the yard, Alice pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed 911. Her voice cracked with urgency as she spoke to the operator, describing the situation, her words tumbling over each other in her haste. "Please, send someone quickly. He's dangerous. And my dog, he's trying to protect us." Within minutes, the piercing sound of sirens filled the air, cutting through the night like a beacon of hope. Red and blue lights flashed, illuminating the darkness as police cars screeched to a halt in front of the house. Alice and Mia clung to each other, relief washing over them as officers poured out of the cars, weapons drawn, prepared to confront the threat within. Inside, Marcus's rage had turned to panic. He stumbled back from Ranger, his grip on the knife loosening as he heard the approaching footsteps and the shouts of the officers. Seeing his moment, Ranger let out one final, defiant growl, his body sagging slightly from the pain but still unyielding. He held his position until the police entered, their voices demanding Marcus drop the weapon and surrender. As Marcus was taken away, Alice rushed back toward the house, her eyes wide with worry for Ranger. She called his name softly, and her heart nearly broke when she saw him standing there, his legs shaky, his fur matted with blood. Mia ran forward, kneeling beside him, her little hands gently touching his face, her tears spilling over. "You saved us, Ranger," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're our hero." Ranger lowered his head, his eyes softening as he nuzzled Mia's hand, offering her one last reassuring gesture before his legs finally gave out, and he lay down, exhausted. Alice immediately called for help, and within minutes, one of the officers who'd seen the situation unfold took it upon himself to lift Ranger carefully, carrying him to his patrol car to rush him to the nearest veterinary clinic. The drive to the clinic was tense. Alice sat beside Ranger, her hand resting on his side, feeling the faint rise and fall of his breathing, praying he'd make it. Mia sat close, her face pressed against her mother's shoulder, her heart aching with worry. At the clinic, the veterinarians moved quickly, assessing Ranger's injuries, administering emergency care to stabilize him. Alice and Mia waited, each passing moment filled with a heavy, anxious silence. Alice's mind raced with a whirlwind of emotions: gratitude, guilt, fear, but above all an overwhelming sense of love for the dog who'd risked everything to keep them safe. Hours later, a vet came out, her expression tired but hopeful. "Ranger's stable. He lost a lot of blood, but he's a fighter. It'll take time, but with care, he should recover." Alice let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her. She pulled Mia close, kissing her daughter's forehead as tears of gratitude filled her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The days that followed were slow and filled with healing. Ranger remained at the clinic initially, receiving round-the-clock care as his wounds slowly began to heal. Alice and Mia visited him daily, bringing small treats and toys, spending hours by his side. Mia would talk to him softly, her words filled with gratitude and love, her little hand resting gently on his head, whispering to him about the future they'd have together. When Ranger was finally strong enough to come home, Alice knew life would never be the same. She had already filed for divorce from Marcus, leaving that dark chapter of their lives behind. From now on, her focus was on healing, for herself, for Mia, and for the loyal companion who had saved them. Back at home, as Ranger lay beside her, Mia felt a new sense of safety and peace. Ranger was her friend, her protector, the constant in a world that had often felt unsteady. And as the months passed, their bond only grew stronger, woven together by the trials they'd faced and the sacrifices Ranger had made. As the months turned into a year, Mia, Ranger, and Alice settled into a new rhythm. The small town they moved to was quiet and peaceful, tucked away from the shadow of their past. Alice found a quaint little house on the outskirts, surrounded by sprawling fields and lined with trees that offered just the kind of privacy and calm she'd longed for. Here, there were no echoes of anger, no fear hiding in corners, just the warmth of a fresh start. The house wasn't much, just a simple two-bedroom with a modest yard, but for Mia and Alice, it felt like a sanctuary. Ranger spent his days in recovery, his strength slowly returning as his wounds healed. His limp softened with time, and soon he was trotting through the yard again, nose to the ground, ever alert to keep an eye on Mia as she played or roamed the fields nearby. To Mia, Ranger was still her brave protector, but now he was also her constant companion, a steady presence that never strayed far. Over time, Alice saw something change in Mia. She was beginning to laugh more often, to speak with a confidence Alice hadn't seen in a long time. Sometimes, she would catch Mia lying in the grass, giggling as Ranger lay beside her, nudging her playfully, as if sharing a secret joke. Ranger seemed to absorb her laughter, his tail wagging gently, his eyes always full of that deep, quiet loyalty. Ranger had become more than just a pet. He was a part of them, woven into the fabric of their little family in a way that Alice couldn't imagine living without. She often found herself watching him with a feeling of gratitude so profound it surprised her. He had given them not only safety, but a chance to heal, to build a life where Mia could grow up unafraid. As Mia continued to blossom, Ranger was always at her side. He was there when she found the courage to join other children at the small town park, his patient gaze calming her nerves. When she stumbled, Ranger would nudge her to stand, his quiet encouragement urging her forward. And when Alice caught sight of Mia laughing, arms spread wide as she ran across the yard with Ranger beside her, she felt a warmth she hadn't known in years, a reassurance that they were finally safe, that they'd found something steady to hold on to. With Ranger's presence, Mia found herself daring to dream a little bigger. She took to reading books under the old tree in the yard, Ranger lying beside her, his head on his paws, as if guarding her thoughts. She began to talk about school, the friends she hoped to make, the things she wanted to learn. And every time she mentioned these dreams, Ranger would look at her with those steady, wise eyes, his silent way of telling her that he believed in her. For Alice, watching Mia's transformation was both healing and humbling. She knew it was Ranger who had given Mia this sense of peace, this chance to grow without fear. And each night, as they sat together on the small porch, the sun setting beyond the fields, Alice would reach down, scratching behind Ranger's ears, whispering her thanks, knowing that he understood. Years slipped by gently, and in the comfort of their new life, Ranger aged alongside Mia. His coat grew grayer, his steps slower, but his loyalty never wavered. Even as his body weakened, his spirit remained as fierce as ever. Every morning, he would follow Mia to the door as she left for school, his eyes watching until she disappeared down the road. And every afternoon he'd wait for her return, his ears perked, his tail giving a faint wag when he spotted her from afar. Mia grew into a confident young woman, grounded by Ranger's steady love. She often found herself sharing stories of him with friends, recounting tales of his bravery and the way he had stood by her through the darkest moments. Ranger had become more than a dog to her. He was a symbol of resilience, a reminder of the strength that could be found in even the most unassuming places. And though Ranger's energy waned with the years, he never left Mia's side. He was there through her triumphs and stumbles, through quiet nights and noisy afternoons. His presence was a quiet, constant, a thread of strength woven into every moment of her life. One cool autumn evening, as the leaves fell in gentle waves around their yard, Mia sat beside Ranger, her hand resting on his back as she gazed out over the fields. Ranger's breathing had grown slower, his eyes tired but content. She sensed he was near the end of his journey, but the thought of saying goodbye felt like an ache she couldn't bear. "Mama," she whispered to Alice that night, her voice trembling, "I don't know how to let him go." Alice pulled her daughter close, her own eyes wet with unshed tears. "You don't have to, sweetheart. Ranger will always be a part of you. He's given you a strength that nothing can take away." In the early hours of the morning, Ranger passed peacefully, surrounded by the family he had loved and protected with all his heart. Mia held him close, whispering her gratitude, her voice soft and steady as she let him go. As Mia grew older, she carried Ranger's memory with her like a talisman, a reminder of the loyalty and resilience he had taught her. She often spoke of him to others, her voice filled with warmth as she recounted the stories of his bravery, his gentle spirit, and the way he had changed her life. All right, friends, before we wrap up, let's talk a bit about this story. Now, while this particular tale isn't real, it does hit on some very real emotions and situations. Our young girl in the story was lucky. She had Ranger, her brave pitbull, who saved her life. But in reality, there are so many children and families who find themselves in difficult or dangerous situations, sometimes without anyone to protect them or help them out. It's a reminder of the kind of challenges that too many people face alone, without that one protective hero. This story also highlights the powerful bond between humans and animals. Ranger may just be a character here, but dogs, like him, are often silent heroes. Protective, loving, and loyal in ways that many of us don't fully realize. For parents out there, this story serves as a gentle reminder to listen closely to your kids, to pay attention when something feels off, and to be their first line of defense. Sometimes the smallest signs can mean the biggest things. And if you've got a dog or any pet that shows you loyalty and kindness every day, don't forget to give them some extra love. Animals are more in tune with us than we know. So what did this story make you feel? Let's keep the conversation going. Drop a comment below. And if you've had a special animal in your life who's made a difference, I'd love to hear your stories too. Thanks for sticking around and sharing this journey with me. See you in the comments.